I was invisible long before I became valuable. That's the thing about being underestimated. You learn to navigate rooms as if you're made of air. 8 years I spent at Sterling and Core Strategies in Denver, watching my ideas bloom in other people's PowerPoints, hearing my research quoted from other people's lips, all while being told I should be grateful just to have a seat at the table. Lana. Ramirez, Edward Sterling would say with that particular smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. Always reliable. Always present. Present. Not brilliant. Not visionary. Just there. The glass and steel headquarters of Sterling and Core dominated the downtown skyline, its upper floors offering breathtaking views of the Rockies. I remember the first time I walked through those doors, with my freshly minted MBA, heart pounding with ambition and hope. I was the first in my family to finish college, let alone graduate school. My mother had cleaned offices at night to help pay for my education. My father had worked double shifts at the factory. Their sacrifice deserved more than what I had become, a glorified assistant with a fancy title but no real power. You'll need to reschedule the Morrison call, Edward announced, dropping a stack of folders on my desk one Tuesday morning. The office buzzed around us, all polished wood and hushed conversations. Brittany and I will be handling the Wallace Foundation pitch from now on. I looked up, my fingers still typing the report I'd been working on since dawn. The Wallace Foundation? But I've been leading that research. For months. His smile tightened. And we appreciate your groundwork. But Brittany has the executive presence we need for this level of client. You understand? Brittany Shaw, who joined the firm 2 years after me but somehow now outranked me. Brittany, who referred to me as our little diversity hire when she thought I wasn't listening. Brittany, whose father golfed with Edward every Sunday. Of course, I said, my voice calm while something inside me cracked. I'll email you my notes. That night, I sat alone in my modest apartment overlooking the city lights. The walls were covered with art from local Latino artists. My small rebellion, my connection to roots I sometimes felt slipping away in corporate America. I poured myself a glass of wine and called the one person who always saw me. He's doing it again, isn't he? My godfather's voice crackled through the speaker, warm and knowing despite the miles between Denver and his New Mexico ranch. Thomas Wallace was not a man most people would connect to me. A reclusive investment genius who had built the Wallace Foundation from nothing. He had been my mother's employer decades ago. He'd discovered her reading finance, books during her lunch breaks while cleaning his office, and something about her determination had moved him. He became her mentor, then my godfather, a quiet guardian who never announced his presence, but never truly left. I'm beginning to think I'm crazy for staying, I admitted. 8 years, Thomas. 8 years of watching people get promoted over me, of having my work attributed to others. Patience is not weakness, Lana, he said, and I could picture him sitting in his study, surrounded by books and the southwestern art he loved. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one nobody notices. I sighed. But what's the point of power if you can't use it? Oh, you'll use it, he chuckled, but only when it matters most. That's what they'll never understand. The difference between power and dominance. I didn't know then how prophetic his words would be, how everything would change just 3 months later when I received the call that Thomas had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was small, attended mostly by Foundation members and a few old friends. I stood apart from the crowd, my grief private and profound. Thomas had been more than a mentor. He had been the voice that told me I belonged in rooms where others suggested I didn't. What I didn't expect was the letter that arrived a week later, requesting my presence at the reading of his will. Ms. Ramirez, the attorney said when I arrived at his Santa Fe office, Mr. Wallace was very specific about your inheritance. I had expected perhaps a book, a painting, some small token of our connection. Instead, the lawyer slid a leather portfolio across the desk. 12% equity in the Wallace Foundation's strategic fund, he explained as I stared at the documents in disbelief, currently valued at approximately $42 million. My hands trembled. There must be some mistake. No mistake. The attorney, an older man with kind eyes, handed me a sealed envelope. He also left you this. Later, alone in my hotel room, I opened Thomas's letter. Lana, by now you know what I've left you. Not because you need it, but because you deserve it. I've watched you fight for recognition in a world that refuses to see your brilliance. I've seen you work twice as hard for half the credit. This equity isn't charity. It's recognition of the strategic mind I've known since You were a girl arguing economics with me at the kitchen table while your mother laughed that no 12-year-old should know what a hedge fund was. Only use it when you're ready. And never let anyone bully you out of your name. With love and complete confidence, Thomas, I sat there until dawn, weighing the power that had suddenly fallen into my hands. Power I had never sought, never expected. Power. That could change everything. But I wasn't ready to wield it. Not yet. So when I returned to Denver, to the gleaming Sterling and Core offices, I said nothing about my inheritance. I filed the documents securely, continued my work, and watched. Because something had changed at the office during my brief absence. Edward Sterling was suddenly interested in the Wallace Foundation in a way he had never been before. He called meetings about strategic partnerships and legacy investments, meetings to which I wasn't invited. And that's when I began to see what Thomas had perhaps known all along. Sometimes invisibility is your greatest advantage when you're surrounded by people who only see what they can take. It would be another month before I discovered just how far Edward Sterling would go to claim what wasn't his, and how being underestimated would become my most unexpected weapon. The Wallace Foundation presents a unique opportunity, Edward Sterling announced to the conference room, his voice carrying that particular timbre of manufactured authority. 20 executives nodded, while I sat at the far end of the table, taking notes nobody would read. Their focus on ethical technology and educational investment aligns perfectly with our new direction. I fought to keep my expression neutral. New direction? Sterling and Core had never shown interest in education or ethical tech until 3 weeks ago. Coincidentally, right after Thomas's passing had made the business news in a small sidebar article. Lana, Edward called suddenly, making me look up. You've done some preliminary research on Wallace, haven't you? Why don't you share the basics? The room's attention swiveled to me. 20 pairs of eyes, most of which barely registered my existence on normal days. This was Edward's favorite tactic, putting me on the spot with no preparation, then using any hesitation as evidence of my inadequacy. Of course, I said, closing my notebook calmly. The Wallace Foundation was established in 1987 by Thomas Wallace after his success with early semiconductor investments. Unlike most foundations of that era, Wallace structured his as a hybrid organization, part charitable foundation, part impact investment fund. Their portfolio currently includes 17 educational technology startups, 4 renewable energy ventures, and significant minority stakes in ethical AI research. I paused, feeling a small flicker of satisfaction at Edward's barely concealed surprise. Their governance structure is particularly interesting, I continued. The foundation operates through a split authority model, with philanthropic decisions requiring board approval, but investment decisions falling to equity stakeholders, who must demonstrate alignment with the foundation's ethical framework. Edward cleared his throat. Yes, well, that's comprehensive. Thank you, Lana. As the meeting continued, I watched Brittany Shaw slide a folder to Edward, one with the Wallace Foundation logo clearly visible, a folder I had never seen before, despite supposedly leading our research on them. Later, as everyone filed out, Jordan Blake, one of the few genuine people in senior management, fell in to step beside me. That was impressive in there, he said quietly, but I'd be careful. Careful of what? Jordan glanced around before answering. Sterling's been having closed-door meetings about Wallace. Big ones, with the legal team. Just watch yourself. That night, I stayed late. The office emptied gradually. First the administrative staff, then the account. Managers? Finally the executives. By 8, only the cleaning crew remained, nodding to me as they vacuumed between cubicles. I waited until they moved to another floor, then made my way to Edward's office. His door was locked, of course, but what few people knew was that the executive suite had been remodeled so hastily last year that all the offices shared the same master key, a key that facilities had accidentally left on my desk during the renovation. Inside his immaculate office, I moved quickly to his computer. It was locked, as expected, but I didn't need it. Instead, I went to the credenza where he kept active files. The Wallace folder sat prominently on top. What I found inside made my blood run cold. Draft documents, prepared by Sterling and Core's legal team, outlining a proposed strategic partnership with the Wallace Foundation. Documents that positioned Edward Sterling as the primary contact and beneficial relationship manager for all foundation investments. Documents that somehow never mentioned my name or my equity. But the worst discovery was a pre-filed SEC registration attempt, listing Edward Sterling as primary strategic steward of the Wallace. Equity position, my inheritance. He was trying to claim my ownership stake as his own, counting on the foundation's board not knowing who I was, or that Thomas had left me anything. I photographed every page with shaking hands, then returned everything exactly as I'd found it. As I slipped out of his office, a voice from the shadows nearly stopped my heart. "Working late, Ms. Ramirez?" Brittany Shaw stood by the elevator, her perfect blonde hair still immaculate despite the hour, her smile not reaching her eyes, a skill she'd clearly learned from Edward. "Just finishing some research," I replied, clutching my phone in my pocket where the evidence was stored. "On the Wallace Foundation?" Her question was too direct, too knowing. "Among other things." She stepped closer. "Edward thinks you're not executive material, you know. Too quiet, too careful." She emphasized the last word with a smile. "But I've always wondered what's going on behind those careful eyes of yours." "Not much," I lied. "Just trying to do good work." She studied me for a moment longer. "Well, don't work too hard. After all, some positions simply have natural limits." The next morning, I arrived to find my desk moved from its spot near the strategy team to a corner by the supply room. My nameplate, which had read Senior Strategy Analyst, had been replaced with one reading Project Coordinator. When I confronted Edward in his office, his response was devastating in its casualness. "The restructuring plan has been in place for months, Lana. We need someone with more executive presence in strategic roles as we pursue these larger accounts." "Like the Wallace Foundation?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or suspicion. "Among others. Brittany will be taking point on those relationships now." "Without even discussing it with me first? After 8 years?" Edward sighed, leaning back in his chair with the practiced patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "Lana, not everyone is cut out for executive decision-making. You should be grateful to still have a place here." He said it loudly enough that heads turned in the open office beyond his glass walls. Heads that quickly looked away when they saw me notice them. As I walked back to my relocated desk, I could feel the weight of curious glances and whispered conversations. I had been publicly diminished, professionally demoted, personally humiliated, but Edward had made a critical mistake. He assumed my silence meant weakness. He assumed my patience meant acceptance. Most of all, he assumed I had no power beyond what he granted me. In my apartment that night, I spread Thomas's documents across my dining table and made a decision. I would not fight Edward with anger or public accusations. I would not storm out in a blaze of righteous indignation. Instead, I would do what I'd always done best: work silently, gather information methodically, and wait for precisely the right moment to act. Because Thomas hadn't just left me money and equity, he'd left me a legacy of strategic thinking, of seeing 3 moves ahead, while others focused on immediate gains. "Only use it when you're ready," he had written. I wasn't ready yesterday. I wasn't ready this morning. But as I carefully organized the evidence of Edward's attempted theft, I realized I was ready now. The beauty of being underestimated is that no one watches what you do. For 3 weeks after my demotion, I moved through Sterling and Core like a ghost, present but unseeable. My new position as project coordinator meant I was copied on countless emails but invited to almost no meetings. Perfect. Every night I stayed late, using my access to piece together Edward's plan. The Wallace Foundation connection wasn't just opportunistic, it was calculated. Edward had learned of Thomas's death and immediately begun positioning himself as the natural liaison to the Foundation's board, a board that rarely interacted directly with individual stakeholders. "You're sure about this?" Jordan asked when I finally confided in him. We sat in a small coffee shop 6 blocks from the office, far from corporate eyes and ears. I slid my phone across the table, showing him the photos of Edward's documents. He's filing paperwork claiming strategic control of my equity position. He doesn't know I own it, but he knows it exists. Jordan whistled low. "That's corporate fraud. Securities fraud, even." "Only if he succeeds," I said, taking back my phone. "Right now, it's just intent." "What are you going to do?" I stirred my coffee, watching the cream create perfect spirals. "I need to understand the full scope first. Who else is involved? How far?" "They've gone with the Foundation." "Brittany's in it up to her neck," Jordan confirmed. "She's been bragging about her Wallace relationship to clients. Says it's going to be her ticket to partner." "And Edward?" Board meeting next week. He's presenting a new strategic direction focused on ethical investment partnerships, using the Wallace connection as the centerpiece. I nodded. Pieces. Falling into place. He's using my inheritance to secure his position with the board. While demoting you to make sure you can't interfere, Jordan added, his expression grim. Classic Sterling move. He did something similar to Marcus in 2018. I remember. Marcus Chen had been pushed out after Edward appropriated his client relationships. He'd left quietly rather than fight, his reputation, subtly damaged by rumors of performance issues. You should talk to legal counsel, Jordan advised, before this gets worse. I already had. The previous weekend, I'd visited Sophia Blake, Jordan's cousin and a securities attorney, at her home outside the city. Away from corporate eyes, I'd shown her everything. Thomas's bequest, Edward's fraudulent filings, the timeline of my demotion. This is extraordinarily brazen, she'd said, reviewing the documents with professional precision. He's counting on the foundation not connecting you to Thomas Wallace. Would they have reason to? Thomas never publicized our relationship. Sophia had smiled then. A smile I was beginning to recognize as the Blake family trait of knowing something others didn't. Let me make some calls. There are people at Wallace who might remember more than Sterling realizes. Now sitting across from Jordan, I kept Sophia's investigation to myself. The fewer people who knew my full strategy, the better. I've got it handled, I assured him, but I need to know if anything changes with the board presentation. Count on it. Jordan hesitated. Lana, when this blows up, and it will, it's going to get ugly. Sterling doesn't lose gracefully. I'm counting on that too. Back at the office, I maintained my invisibility. I organized files, attended minor meetings, and projected an air of resigned acceptance. Meanwhile, I meticulously documented every communication related to Wallace, building an unassailable timeline of Edward's deception. The most revealing moment came 3 days later, when I was accidentally copied on an email from Brittany to Edward. Wallace Foundation confirmed for next Thursday. Daniel Graves is attending personally. This is huge. He rarely leaves NY for these meetings. Legal is finalizing the presentation deck emphasizing our long-standing relationship with Wallace Initiatives. Should we be concerned about the R situation? Seems too quiet lately. B, the R. Situation. Me, Lana Ramirez. I forwarded the email to my personal account and deleted it from my work inbox. Daniel Graves, I knew that name. He was a founding board member of the Wallace Foundation, one of Thomas's oldest friends and business partners. His presence elevated this from opportunistic corporate maneuvering to something far more significant. That night, I called Sophia. Daniel, Graves is coming to Denver for a meeting with Sterling, I told her without preamble. Next Thursday. Her quick intake of breath told me everything. That's interesting timing. Why? Because I spoke with him yesterday, about Thomas's bequest to you. My heart skipped. And he was very interested to learn that Thomas's goddaughter worked at Sterling & Core. He had no idea the firm had any connection to the Wallace family. Did you tell him about Edward's attempt to claim my equity? Not explicitly, Sophia replied, and I could hear the careful consideration in her voice. I simply mentioned that there seemed to be some confusion about the rightful ownership of the shares. He said he'd look into it personally. For the first time in weeks, I felt something loosen in my chest. A knot of anxiety giving way to something like hope. Or perhaps justice. What should I do when he comes? Nothing, Sophia advised. Let events unfold naturally, but be prepared for anything. The following days passed in a blur of anticipation and strategic preparation. I verified every document, organized my evidence chronologically, and prepared contingencies for various scenarios. At work, I maintained my facade of quiet resignation while observing the mounting excitement among the executive team. Edward was practically glowing with confidence. He conducted multiple rehearsals of his presentation, each time emphasizing our deep connection to the Wallace legacy and our natural alignment with the Foundation's values. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so infuriating. Brittany shadowed him constantly, adding details about investment strategies she'd had no part in developing, strategies I had researched months ago. Once, catching my eye across the bullpen, she smiled with such smug certainty that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The night before Daniel Graves's visit, I couldn't sleep. I stood at my apartment window, looking out at the Denver skyline, remembering Thomas's words, "Only use it when you're ready." Was I ready for what would come tomorrow? For the public confrontation, the potential fallout? Once I stepped forward, there would be no going back to quiet invisibility. My phone chimed with a text from Sophia. Everything confirmed. Trust the process. I took a deep breath and replied with a single word. Ready. The Sterling and Core conference room gleamed with expensive minimalism, glass, chrome, and views of the Rockies that made clients feel they were literally on top of the world. I arrived early, taking my assigned seat at the far end of the table, away from the action, exactly where Edward wanted me. Coordinate the catering, would you? Brittany asked as she swept past, not waiting for my response. Her cream silk, blouse and tailored navy suit projected effortless authority, while her diamond earrings caught the morning light with calculated precision. I nodded, already having handled the arrangements days ago. My own outfit, a simple charcoal pantsuit with a burgundy blouse, was professional but understated. Today wasn't about drawing attention through appearance. The executive team filed in gradually, an atmosphere of suppressed excitement humming through the room. Edward arrived last, immaculate in his bespoke suit, greeting everyone with practiced warmth while studiously avoiding eye contact with me. At precisely 10 a.m., the receptionist's voice announced our visitor's arrival. Daniel Graves entered like a force of nature, tall, black, impeccably dressed, with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. At 72, he moved with the vitality of a much younger man, his keen eyes missing nothing. Edward Sterling, he said, his deep voice carrying a trace of his Louisiana upbringing. A pleasure to finally meet in person. The pleasure is all ours, Mr. Graves, Edward replied, gesturing toward the seat of honor. We're thrilled you could make the trip from New York. I go where interesting opportunities arise, Daniel said, settling into the chair. His gaze swept the room, pausing momentarily as it passed over me. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition? Before he returned his attention to Edward. The meeting began with practiced corporate ritual. Introductions, pleasantries, subtle establishing of credentials. Edward was, in his element, commanding the room with well-rehearsed charisma. Brittany hovered at his right hand, adding polished commentary at perfectly timed intervals. As you know, Edward continued after preliminary discussions, Sterling and Core has been developing a new strategic direction focused on ethical investment partnerships. The Wallace Foundation represents exactly the kind of alignment we seek. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. And how long has your firm been involved with Wallace initiatives? Edward's smile didn't falter. We've been following the Foundation's work for some time, but our formal interest developed more recently. We see tremendous potential for mutually beneficial collaboration, particularly in educational technology. Brittany added smoothly. We've done extensive research on the Foundation's portfolio in that sector. Daniel leaned back slightly. Research conducted by whom exactly? A brief hesitation before Edward answered. Our strategic team, of course. Brittany has been leading that effort. I kept my expression neutral, eyes on my notepad, as Brittany launched into a detailed overview of Wallace Foundation investments, information taken directly from my research files. The presentation continued for nearly an hour, building toward what Edward clearly considered his masterstroke. The screen behind him displayed a complex diagram of proposed partnerships, with Sterling and Core positioned as the strategic steward of Foundation resources. Which brings us to the most exciting aspect, Edward said, his voice rising with practiced enthusiasm. Through a series of fortunate connections, we've established a position that allows us to offer unprecedented access to Wallace decision-making processes. Daniel Graves sat forward slightly. What position would that be exactly? A beneficial interest in the strategic fund, Edward replied smoothly. We've filed preliminary documentation with the SEC to formalize the arrangement. The room felt suddenly still. I could hear the soft hum of the ventilation system, the distant ring of a phone beyond the conference room doors. Interesting, Daniel said, his tone revealing nothing. I wasn't aware that any such interest had been transferred to Sterling and Core. Edward's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Not to the firm directly, but through a strategic partnership agreement that effectively grants us stewardship. Daniel reached into his briefcase and withdrew a slim folder. That's curious because according to the Foundation's records, Thomas Wallace left those specific shares to someone named. He opened the folder, though I suspected he didn't need to check the name. Lana Ramirez. The silence that followed was absolute. Every head turned slowly in my direction. Edward's face went completely blank, then flushed with color. Brittany froze mid-note-taking, her pen hovering above her leather portfolio. That can't be, Edward stammered, his composure cracking for the first time I could remember. Ms. Ramirez, Daniel said, addressing me directly. Are you familiar with this arrangement? 8 years of being overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed crystallized into this single moment. I reached into my bag and withdrew the leather portfolio Thomas's attorney had given me. Yes, Mr. Graves, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I am Thomas Wallace's goddaughter. He left me 12% equity in the Wallace Foundation's strategic fund upon his death 3 months ago. I stood and walked to the center of the table, placing my documentation in front of Daniel. And these, I continued, adding the stack of photos and documents I'd gathered, are copies of attempts made by Mr. Sterling to claim that equity as his own, without my knowledge or consent. Edward's face had gone from red to ashen. This is absurd. Lana is a mid-level employee with no connection to... I have known Thomas Wallace since I was a child, I interrupted, my voice gaining strength. My mother worked for him for 15 years. He paid for my education. He mentored me. And yes, he left me a significant equity position in his foundation. Daniel examined the documents with methodical care, his expression revealing nothing until he looked up at Edward. Mr. Sterling, these filings appear to constitute attempted securities fraud. Can you explain why you're claiming control of assets legally belonging to Ms. Ramirez? The room erupted into murmurs. Jordan, seated halfway down the table, wore an expression of barely suppressed satisfaction. Other executives shifted uncomfortably, suddenly uncertain which side of this rapidly developing chasm they should position themselves on. Edward stood abruptly. This meeting is adjourned. Mr. Graves, perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. I think not, Daniel replied, closing the folder deliberately. In fact, I believe my next conversation should be with Ms. Ramirez. He turned to me. Would you be available this afternoon? Before I could answer, Edward made his fatal mistake. This is ridiculous, he snarled, his carefully cultivated poise evaporating completely. Lana has no vision, no value, and no future at this level of business. She's been here 8 years without advancing because she lacks every quality needed for leadership. The naked contempt in his voice silenced the room. In that moment, everyone saw the real Edward Sterling. Not the polished executive, but the man who would steal another's inheritance and publicly humiliate them rather than acknowledge their worth. I gathered my materials calmly, though my hands wanted to tremble, not with fear, but with the strange power of finally being seen. She's standing right here, I said, looking Edward directly in the eyes. And I'm ready to take back what's mine. The aftermath of a corporate earthquake is strangely quiet. I sat across from Daniel Graves in a private dining room at the Ibis Oxford Hotel, watching as he methodically organized the documents I'd provided. Outside, Denver continued its ordinary Tuesday afternoon. People hurrying between meetings, tourists photographing historic buildings, life proceeding as if nothing monumental had occurred. Thomas spoke of you often, Daniel said finally, looking up from the papers, though he was careful never to connect you publicly to his foundation. He was protective that way, I replied, still processing the reality that I was having lunch with one of the most influential investors in America. He thought it was important I make my own way. Daniel smiled slightly. And yet he left you 12% of his legacy. I was as surprised as anyone. I doubt that. His eyes, keen and evaluating, studied me with interest. Thomas didn't make impulsive decisions, especially about his foundation. He must have seen something in you that justified such extraordinary confidence. The waiter arrived with our meals, a brief reprieve from the intensity of the conversation. When he departed, Daniel continued as if there had been no interruption. What Edward Sterling attempted was not merely unethical, but likely criminal. Securities fraud carries significant penalties. I set down my fork. I'm not interested in pressing charges. Daniel raised an eyebrow. May I ask why not? The question gave me pause. Why wasn't I seeking maximum punishment for someone who had tried to steal my inheritance and publicly humiliated me? The answer came with surprising clarity. Because this was never about punishing. Edward, it's about reclaiming what's mine. My inheritance, yes, but more importantly, my professional dignity. Daniel nodded slowly. And what do you intend to do with both now that you have them back? The question hung between us, a test, perhaps, or an opportunity. I considered my response carefully. The equity position gives me influence within the foundation, but I don't yet know enough about its operations to use that influence responsibly. As for my professional future, I met his gaze directly. I won't be returning to Sterling and Core. I should hope not, Daniel replied with the ghost of a smile, though I suspect Edward's own position there has become rather precarious. He wasn't wrong. Even as we spoke, the Sterling and Core board was convening an emergency session. Jordan had texted me brief updates. Edward suspended pending investigation. Brittany claiming complete ignorance of any wrongdoing. The legal team in damage control mode. What will you do? Daniel asked again, more directly this time. I had been asking myself the same question since walking out of that conference room 3 hours ago. The answer had been forming slowly, piece by piece. I believe in what Thomas built, I said. The Foundation's mission of ethical investment in education and technology aligns with everything I value professionally. I'd like to honor that legacy by being an active, informed stakeholder, not just a name on ownership documents. Daniel's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested approval. That would require significant industry, knowledge, connections, resources, all things I've been developing for 8 years, even if others refuse to see it. He nodded thoughtfully. The Foundation Board meets monthly in New York. As a significant equity holder, you have standing invitation to attend. I'll be there. Next week, he added, watching for my reaction. I didn't hesitate. Next week. The remainder of our lunch focused on Foundation specifics, current initiatives, portfolio structure, board dynamics. Daniel was thorough without being condescending, clearly evaluating my understanding while providing context I lacked. By the time we finished, I felt both overwhelmed and strangely centered, as if pieces of my life were aligning in ways I couldn't yet fully comprehend. As we prepared to leave, Daniel handed me his card, heavy cream stock with only his name and a phone number embossed in simple black type. Thomas believed in you, he said. That carries significant weight with me. But ultimately, what matters is what you do with the opportunity he's given you. I understand. Do you? His gaze was penetrating. Because many people would see $42 million as an endpoint rather than a beginning. I tucked the card carefully into my wallet. Thomas didn't mentor me to be many people. For the first time, Daniel Graves smiled fully, a warm expression that transformed his austere features. No, he agreed. He certainly did not. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of practical necessities. I submitted my resignation to Sterling and Core's HR department via email, declining their panicked request for an exit interview. I contracted a security company to collect my personal items from the office, unwilling to subject myself to the stares and whispers that would inevitably follow my return. Jordan kept me updated on the corporate fallout. Edward placed on indefinite administrative leave. Corporate speak for, we're figuring out how to fire him without being sued. Brittany frantically distancing herself from the scandal. The board launching a comprehensive ethics review that had executives scrambling to cover past indiscretions. They're terrified you'll sue, Jordan reported during our coffee meeting. Legal is preparing for catastrophic damages. I'm not going to sue, I repeated, as long as they don't interfere with my Wallace Foundation position. Jordan studied me with concern. After what they did to you, after 8 years of being overlooked and undervalued, you could own the company, Lana. I shook my head. That's not what this is about for me. Then what is it about? The question echoed Daniel's from days earlier. This time my answer came more readily. Moving forward, building something meaningful with what Thomas left. Me, not just the money, but the confidence, the perspective. Jordan nodded slowly. And Sterling? After what he said about you having no vision, no value, no future? The memory of those words still stung, but the pain was dulling, replaced by something like pity. Edward's worldview only recognizes certain kinds of power, I said. The loudest voice, the most aggressive stance, the splashiest deal. He couldn't see the power in patience, in careful observation, in strategic waiting. I smiled slightly. Thomas could. That's why I have $42 million, and Edward has an empty corner office. 3 days after my confrontation with Edward, I boarded a flight to New York. My apartment was sublet, my most important belongings packed into 2 suitcases. The rest would follow when I found permanent housing. As the plane lifted above the Rockies, I felt a strange mixture of loss and liberation. Denver had been my home since graduate school. Sterling and Core had been the focus of my professional identity for 8 years. Both were now behind me, casualties of a transformation I was still struggling to fully comprehend. My phone chimed with a text from Sophia. NYT business. Section tomorrow. Heads up. The following morning, in my hotel room overlooking Central Park, I opened the digital edition of the New York Times to find a modest headline in the business section. Wallace Foundation stakeholder dispute leads to executive suspension at Denver firm. The article was factual but incomplete, mentioning irregularities in securities filings and questions regarding rightful ownership of foundation shares. My name appeared only once, identified as Lana Ramirez, goddaughter of the late Thomas Wallace and legitimate holder of the disputed equity position. Edward was quoted offering a bland statement about misunderstandings and ongoing internal review. The Wallace Foundation declined to comment beyond confirming my ownership stake. It wasn't front page news. It wouldn't shake the financial world. But in the circles that mattered, venture capital, impact investing, foundation governance, the story would resonate. Edward Sterling had attempted to appropriate a significant equity position and been publicly exposed. His reputation, built on decades of carefully cultivated relationships, was irreparably damaged. And mine? That remained to be written. New York in autumn hit differently than Denver. More intense, more urgent, somehow both warmer and cooler in its embrace. I navigated the crowded sidewalks of Manhattan with a mixture of trepidation and exhilaration, still adjusting to the city's distinctive rhythm. The Wallace Foundation occupied 3 floors of an understated building in Midtown. No gleaming skyscraper, no ostentatious signage, just discreet brass lettering beside heavy oak doors. The security guard checked my ID, made a call, and directed me to the elevators with respectful efficiency. "Ms. Ramirez," a woman greeted me as I stepped onto the 14th floor. "I'm Helen Chang, Mr. Graves' assistant. He asked me to show you to the boardroom." I followed her through a space that defied typical corporate aesthetics. Where Sterling and Core had been all sharp angles and sterile minimalism, the Wallace Foundation felt almost residential. Warm wood paneling, comfortable seating areas, walls adorned with art from around the world. Thomas's influence was everywhere, from the southwestern textiles to the carefully curated library visible through glass doors. "Everyone's assembled," Helen informed me, pausing outside an imposing doorway. "Would you like a moment before we go in?" I took a deep breath, straightening my blazer and mentally rehearsing the introduction I'd prepared. "I'm ready." The boardroom contained a single oval table surrounded by 12 people who collectively controlled billions in philanthropic assets. Daniel Graves stood as I entered, offering a slight nod. "Ms. Ramirez, welcome. Allow me to introduce the Wallace Foundation Board." The next 15 minutes were a blur of names, titles, and assessing glances. I recognized some faces from my research. Dr. Elaine Wright, the education policy expert, Marcus Hamilton, the tech innovator, Senator William Ortega, retired but still influential in regulatory circles. "Ms. Ramirez holds 12% equity in our strategic fund," Daniel explained once introductions were complete. "As Thomas's goddaughter and designated successor, she joins us today to better understand our operations and governance." "Rather unexpected," commented Lawrence Wilson, a silver-haired banker whose tone suggested disapproval. "Thomas never mentioned a goddaughter with significant equity rights." "Thomas was notably private about his personal relationships," Daniel replied smoothly, "but his legal provisions were unambiguous. And fortunate," added Dr. Wright with a warm smile, "given the rather unsavory attempt by Sterling and Core to claim Ms. Ramirez's position." Lawrence's expression soured further. "Yes, well, that remains concerning. A proper vetting process might have prevented such complications." I recognized the challenge for what it was. Not just questioning my legitimacy, but my competence. 8 years at Sterling and Core had taught me to recognize when I was being tested. "Mr. Wilson," I said, meeting his gaze directly, "I understand your concern. The Wallace Foundation represents significant financial and social capital. Thomas's decision to include me as a stakeholder was unexpected, even to me." I opened my portfolio, extracting the presentation I'd prepared. An assistant distributed copies around the table. However, as you'll see from these materials, I've spent the past week conducting a comprehensive analysis of the Foundation's current portfolio, governance structure, and strategic initiatives. I've identified areas of alignment with my own expertise, particularly in educational technology investment and ethical AI development. The room fell silent as board members reviewed my analysis. It was thorough, professional, and, most importantly, demonstrated both respect for the foundation's existing work and thoughtful perspective on potential growth areas. This is quite detailed, Lawrence admitted reluctantly. Thomas valued preparation, I replied simply. Dr. Wright looked up from the documents with newfound interest. Your background is in strategic investment analysis? Yes, 8 years at Sterling & Core, focusing on emerging technologies and social impact ventures. Before that, MBA from Colorado State, with concentration in sustainable business development. And before that? Asked Senator Ortega unexpectedly. I hesitated only briefly. Daughter of a factory worker and an office cleaner. First-generation college graduate on scholarship. Mentored by Thomas since childhood. The senator nodded, something like approval in his expression. Thomas always did have an eye for unrecognized potential. The meeting proceeded with a comprehensive overview of current foundation initiatives, educational grants in underserved communities, technology incubators focused on accessibility, research funding for ethical AI development. I listened attentively, asking targeted questions that demonstrated engagement without challenging existing authority structures. By the time we broke for lunch, I sensed a subtle shift in the room's energy, from wary evaluation to cautious acceptance. Not universal, Lawrence Wilson still watched me with thinly veiled skepticism, but progress nonetheless. You handled that well, Daniel commented as we moved to an adjacent dining room where a buffet had been arranged. Lawrence can be traditional in his views. You mean he doesn't believe a Latina from a working-class background belongs at this table? I replied quietly. Daniel's expression remained neutral, but his eyes crinkled slightly. Lawrence doesn't believe anyone under 50 belongs at this table. The fact that you're a woman of color simply gives him additional material to work with. And the others? Impressed, I think. Your preparation speaks volumes. As lunch progressed, conversation shifted from formal foundation business to more casual discussion. Dr. Wright engaged me on educational technology trends. Marcus. Hamilton asked insightful questions about my perspective on ethical AI guidelines. Even Senator Ortega shared an anecdote about Thomas from their early business days. Only Lawrence maintained his distance, speaking primarily with the Foundation's legal counsel at the far end of the table. After lunch, the meeting continued with discussion of upcoming funding decisions and portfolio reviews. I contributed where appropriate but mostly observed, learning the board's dynamics and decision-making patterns. By 4 o'clock, when Daniel formally adjourned the session, I had a much clearer understanding of both the Foundation's operations and my potential role within them. Ms. Ramirez, Daniel said as board members gathered their materials, would you join me in my office before you leave? I followed him to a corner suite overlooking the city, the walls lined with books and photographs documenting a lifetime of global philanthropy. He gestured to a comfortable chair while pouring 2 glasses of water from a crystal decanter. Your impressions? He asked, settling behind his desk. The Foundation is more diversified than I expected, I replied honestly. The public focus on education, and technology obscures significant investments in healthcare innovation and climate resilience. Daniel nodded. Thomas believed in balanced portfolios, in finance and in social impact. I also noticed certain tensions on the board. Perceptive. He leaned back slightly. Lawrence represents our more traditional banking partners. His primary concern is financial performance, often at the expense of social impact metrics. While you and Dr. Wright prioritize measurable community outcomes alongside financial returns. Correct. Daniel studied me with renewed interest. The balance has shifted since Thomas's passing. Lawrence's faction is pushing for more conventional investment approaches, higher returns, lower risk tolerance, less emphasis on emerging social entrepreneurs. I understood the subtext immediately. My 12% equity might prove decisive in maintaining Thomas's original vision for the Foundation. What did Thomas want for the Foundation's future? I asked. Daniel's expression softened slightly. He wanted it to remain bold, innovative, willing to back unconventional thinkers with unconventional solutions. He paused meaningfully. People like you, Lana. The use of my first name, deliberate, personal, underscored the shift in our relationship from formal to potentially collaborative. I need time, I said, to understand the full scope of the Foundation's work, to determine how I can contribute most effectively. Of course. Daniel handed me a folder I hadn't noticed on his desk. This contains information on our New York office space, which includes several apartments for visiting stakeholders and researchers. You're welcome to use one while you determine your next steps. The generosity of the offer, and its practical value, wasn't lost on me. Thank you. As I stood to leave, Daniel asked one final question. Have you heard from Sterling since your departure? Their legal team sent a settlement offer yesterday. Generous. Compensation in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement and waiver of all claims. And your response? I smiled slightly. I informed them that I have no intention of pursuing legal action, but also no interest in pretending their actions never occurred. Daniel nodded with what looked like satisfaction. Thomas would approve. He extended his hand. Welcome to the Wallace Foundation, Ms. Ramirez. I suspect this is just the beginning of a very interesting journey. As I left the building and stepped into the New York afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. Unbound by Edward Sterling's limited vision of my worth, unconstrained by corporate hierarchies designed to keep people like me in prescribed places. Thomas had given me more than money. He'd given me freedom to define my own future, and I was just getting started. The Wallace Foundation apartment was nothing like I had imagined. Instead of corporate sterility, I found myself in a warmly furnished one-bedroom on the 12th floor, with windows overlooking Madison Avenue and bookshelves filled with an eclectic mix of business texts, literary classics, and international fiction. A handwritten note on the kitchen counter welcomed me to Thomas's favorite city retreat. I spent my first week in New York establishing routines, finding a neighborhood coffee shop, locating the nearest grocery store, identifying running routes through Central Park. Small anchors of normalcy in a life that had been completely upended. By day, I immersed myself in foundation documents, annual reports, investment criteria, historical performance metrics. At night, I explored the city, sometimes alone, sometimes with Helen Chang, who had taken it upon herself to ensure I wasn't completely lost in my new environment. The foundation hasn't had fresh energy in years, she confided over dim sum in Chinatown. Most of the board members have been there since Thomas first appointed them. Including Lawrence Wilson? I asked, reaching for a dumpling. Helen's expression turned diplomatic. Mr. Wilson has strong opinions about foundation governance. You mean he thinks I don't belong there? She didn't deny it. Lawrence comes from traditional banking. He values credentials, pedigree, established networks. Your arrival was unexpected, and my background doesn't fit his notion of who should. Control foundation assets, I added. Helen studied me thoughtfully. Thomas always said institutions need disruption to avoid stagnation. Perhaps you're the disruption the foundation needs. Her words stayed with me, echoing through quiet evenings in the apartment as I contemplated my next steps. 12% equity made me a significant stakeholder, but not a controlling one. To truly honor Thomas's legacy, I would need to establish my own voice within the foundation, not merely as his goddaughter, but as a strategic thinker with valuable perspective. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 weeks after my arrival, Daniel invited me to review a pending investment proposal, an educational technology platform developed by a team from historically Black colleges and universities. The technology is promising, Daniel explained as we sat in his office reviewing the business plan. Adaptive learning algorithms that respond to diverse learning styles, with particular emphasis on students from underrepresented communities. But Lawrence's committee flagged it as unproven with limited market potential. I scanned the financial projections with practiced eyes. The addressable market is actually significant if you look beyond traditional educational institutions to workforce development programs and corporate training. That's what I thought. Daniel leaned back, watching me. Would you be willing to conduct a more thorough analysis? Something the full board could review? I recognized the test and the opportunity for what it was. I'd need access to our current educational technology portfolio for comparison metrics. Already arranged. He slid a tablet across the desk. Helen has uploaded all relevant files to your secure account. For the next week, I worked with focused intensity, pulling 14-hour days analyzing the proposal from every angle. I built comprehensive financial models, researched the founding team's background, assessed competing technologies, and identified potential integration points with existing foundation initiatives. The resulting report was the most thorough work product I'd ever created. 57 pages of detailed analysis, backed by data visualizations and strategic recommendations. I submitted it to Daniel 2 days before the investment committee meeting, expecting notes or revision requests. Instead, he called me directly. This is exceptional work, Lana. Would you present it to the committee yourself? My pulse quickened. Lawrence chairs that committee. Yes, he does. Daniel's tone was neutral, but I detected a hint of challenge. Is that a problem? I thought of Edward Sterling, of 8 years spent deferring to men who underestimated me. Not at all. I'll be prepared. The investment committee consisted of 5 board members, with Lawrence Wilson presiding. When I entered the conference room, his expression of barely concealed annoyance made it clear my presence wasn't welcome. Ms. Ramirez, he acknowledged stiffly. Daniel informs us you've prepared an alternative assessment of the Mosaic learning proposal. A comprehensive analysis, I corrected politely, distributing printed copies of my report while Helen set up the digital presentation. Based on integration potential with our existing educational portfolio. Lawrence's frown deepened as he skimmed the executive summary. This appears quite extensive for someone who's only been with us a month. 6 weeks, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. And I've spent most of that time studying. Foundation operations and investment criteria. Dr. Wright, seated to Lawrence's right, intervened smoothly. We appreciate your thoroughness, Ms. Ramirez. Please proceed. For the next 40 minutes, I presented my analysis with methodical precision, highlighting Mosaic Learning's innovative approach to educational equity, demonstrating market potential beyond Lawrence's narrow assessment, and outlining a phased investment strategy that would mitigate risk while positioning the foundation for significant impact. Throughout, Lawrence watched with thinly veiled skepticism, occasionally interrupting with pointed questions designed to undermine my credibility. I answered each calmly, backing my responses with data and strategic reasoning rather than defensive rhetoric. Your optimism is admirable, he said when I concluded, but perhaps colored by inexperience. The foundation can't justify million-dollar investments based on social impact metrics alone. I agree completely, I replied, surprising him, which is why my recommendation includes specific financial performance benchmarks alongside social impact goals. Page 43 details the ROI framework, including quarterly evaluation points and clear criteria for continued funding. Lawrence turned to the indicated page, momentarily silenced by the precision of my financial modeling. Dr. Wright exchanged glances with Marcus Hamilton, both looking quietly impressed. Well, Lawrence said finally, this certainly gives us additional perspective to consider. Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. I recognized the dismissal and gathered my materials, thanking the committee for their time. As I reached the door, Dr. Wright called after me. Lana, would you be available to join us for the deliberation? Your insights could be valuable to the discussion. Lawrence's expression tightened, but he couldn't reasonably object without appearing obstructionist. If Ms. Ramirez has the time, of course. I returned to the table, catching Daniel's subtle nod of approval from the doorway before he departed. For the next hour, I participated in the committee's evaluation process, answering technical questions, clarifying analysis points, occasionally challenging assumptions that seemed disconnected from educational realities. By the end, the committee voted 4-1 to recommend Mosaic Learning for a $2 million initial investment with potential for additional funding based on performance metrics. Lawrence's was the lone dissenting vote. As the meeting adjourned, Dr. Wright approached me with a warm smile. Exceptional work, Lana. That's exactly the kind of rigorous analysis we need, grounded in both financial reality and our social impact mission. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute. Don't thank me yet, she replied, lowering her voice. Lawrence isn't accustomed to being overruled. He'll be watching for any misstep going forward. I nodded, understanding the political landscape I'd entered. I expect nothing less. That evening, Daniel called to congratulate me. The full board approved the investment recommendation. Mosaic Learning will receive their first funding tranche next month. That's wonderful news. It's also a significant shift, he added. Lawrence's investment committee rarely approves projects he opposes. Your analysis made the difference. I absorbed this, understanding both the accomplishment and the potential consequences. Will this create problems with Lawrence? Undoubtedly, Daniel replied with surprising frankness, but perhaps necessary ones. The foundation has been drifting toward safer, more traditional investments since Thomas passed. Your perspective, emphasizing both financial viability and genuine social impact, reminds us of our original mission. After we hung up, I stood at my apartment window watching Manhattan's lights flicker against the darkening sky. 6 weeks ago, I had been a demoted project coordinator at Sterling by he. Core, my professional identity defined by Edward's limited vision of my worth. Now, I had directly influenced a multi-million-dollar investment decision at one of the country's most respected foundations. The speed of the transformation was dizzying, yet strangely, I felt more centered than I had in years. In Denver, I had always been fighting to be seen, to be heard, to be valued. Here, my voice mattered not because I demanded recognition, but because I had something meaningful to contribute. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Heard about your victory from Jordan's cousin on the Wallace legal team. Well done. Also, sterling news. Check your email. The message from Sophia's law firm contained a brief update. Edward Sterling had been permanently removed as CEO of Sterling & Core, following an internal investigation that revealed multiple incidents of ethical misconduct and fiduciary breaches. The board had appointed an interim leadership team while conducting a search for permanent replacement. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not even relief. Edward Sterling seemed increasingly irrelevant to my present reality. A chapter closed, a lesson learned, but no longer defining my professional journey. Instead, I found myself thinking about Mosaic Learning's founders, educators from HBCUs who had developed innovative technology to address systemic inequities in education. Their vision would now have resources to reach students nationwide, potentially transforming thousands of lives. And I had helped make that possible. As I prepared for bed that night, Thomas's words echoed in my mind. Only use it when you're ready. For the first time, I truly understood what he meant. The inheritance wasn't just about equity or money, it was about influence, about having a voice in decisions that mattered, about directing resources toward work that created meaningful change. I was ready now, and I was just getting started. The Denver Tribune wants to interview you about your transition from Sterling & Core to the Wallace Foundation. Daniel's announcement caught me mid-sip during our weekly strategy meeting, causing me to nearly choke on my coffee. 3 months into my New York residency, these morning sessions had become a cornerstone of my integration into foundation operations. Informal discussions where Daniel shared institutional history and governance nuances rarely documented in official materials. Me specifically? I asked, regaining composure. Why? Edward Sterling's departure has generated significant industry attention. Your story represents the other side of that equation, the undervalued talent who proved her worth. I set down my cup carefully. I'm not interested in being positioned as Edward's victim or antagonist. Nor should you be, Daniel agreed. But there's value in controlling your own narrative. Otherwise, others will create it for you. He had a point. Since my departure from Denver, I'd maintained deliberate silence about the circumstances, focusing instead on establishing my credibility within the foundation. But the business press had begun constructing their own version of events, portraying me, variously as a fortunate heiress, a corporate whistleblower, or a strategic opportunist. What would the focus be? I asked cautiously. Your professional journey, your vision for impact investing, your perspective on recognizing talent in unexpected places. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Lawrence's faction is already painting you as Thomas's sentimental choice, rather than a qualified stakeholder. This offers opportunity to establish your credentials publicly. The strategic necessity became clear. My work with Mosaic Learning had earned respect within the foundation, but external perception remained shaped by incomplete information about my background and qualifications. I'll consider it, I told Daniel, already mentally drafting talking points that would emphasize my expertise without dwelling on Sterling & Core's ethical failures. The following week brought another unexpected development. Jordan Blake arrived in New York for what he described as a career exploration trip, but quickly revealed as a deliberate effort to see me. Sterling & Core is imploding, he reported over dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the village. The interim leadership team discovered Edward had been manipulating client relationships for years, taking credit for other people's work, hiding negative performance metrics, even redirecting certain clients to his brother-in-law's firm for kickbacks. I twirled pasta around my fork, absorbing this information with surprising detachment. And Brittany, resigned 2 weeks ago, claimed she knew nothing about Edward's schemes, but nobody's buying it. She's having trouble landing anywhere reputable. And you? What's next for Jordan Blake? He grinned, the expression lighting his features in a way I'd rarely seen in Denver. I've been talking with venture firms that actually value ethical leadership. 2 serious offers so far. That's wonderful. I meant it sincerely. Jordan had been one of the few genuinely decent people at Sterling & Core, ambitious, but not at others' expense. What about you? he asked. Found your footing at Wallace? I considered the question thoughtfully. It's been educational. The foundation operates at a scale I'm still adjusting to, with dynamics I'm still learning to navigate. Lawrence Wilson being one of those dynamics. Jordan raised an eyebrow. The financial circles are buzzing about your mosaic learning triumph. Apparently he's not taking it well. I sighed. Jordan's network had always been impressively well-informed. Lawrence represents a particular approach to foundation governance, one that prioritizes financial metrics over social impact, while you represent Thomas Wallace's original vision of balanced returns. Jordan raised his glass. To disrupting the established order. I clinked my glass against his, smiling despite my reservations about being cast as a disruptor. To doing the right work for the right reasons. Jordan's visit provided welcome connection to my past, while reinforcing how dramatically my life had changed. When he departed for Denver 2 days later, I felt newly committed to defining my role within the foundation. Not as Thomas's proxy, but as a strategic voice with distinct perspective. The opportunity to demonstrate that perspective came unexpectedly the following week, when Daniel asked me to join a small working group focused on revising the foundation's investment criteria. The timing wasn't coincidental. Lawrence had been pushing for changes that would shift emphasis toward traditional financial metrics and away from social impact measures. Our first working session revealed the depth of philosophical division within the foundation. Lawrence and his allies advocated for streamlined criteria that would essentially transform the foundation's approach to mirror conventional venture capital, prioritizing market growth potential and financial returns above all else. The foundation exists to generate resources for charitable activities, Lawrence argued, his patrician features set in practiced certainty. Every dollar we sacrifice to impact considerations is a dollar lost to our philanthropic mission. That frames impact as a cost rather than a value, I countered, keeping my tone measured despite my frustration. Thomas structured the foundation specifically to integrate financial and social returns, recognizing that meaningful change requires both. Lawrence's dismissive glance suggested he found my invocation of Thomas's intentions presumptuous. With respect, Ms. Ramirez, some of us worked with Thomas for decades. The foundation's evolution reflects changing market realities he would surely recognize. The condescension was familiar, reminiscent of Edward. Sterling's practiced diminishment. But unlike my years at Sterling & Core, I now occupied a position where my voice carried institutional weight. I've prepared an alternative framework, I said, distributing documents I'd developed over the previous weekend. It maintains rigorous financial standards while formalizing our commitment to measurable social outcomes. My proposal introduced a balanced scorecard approach, establishing minimum financial return thresholds while creating specific metrics for social impact across different investment categories. The methodology was sophisticated yet implementable, drawing on both foundation history and emerging best practices in impact measurement. Dr. Wright reviewed the materials with evident approval. This elegantly addresses the false dichotomy between financial performance and social impact. Well done, Lana. Even Marcus Hamilton, who typically aligned with Lawrence on financial matters, nodded appreciatively. The quantitative rigor here is impressive. It gives us objective criteria for evaluating non-financial returns. Lawrence, however, was unmoved. Unnecessarily complex. The market already provides perfect measurement. Through price signals. This, he gestured dismissively at my proposal, introduces subjective factors that will inevitably reduce overall returns. Only if you define returns solely in financial terms, I replied evenly. The Foundation's charter explicitly embraces broader impact measures. The working group ultimately divided, 3 members supporting my approach, 2, including Lawrence, opposing it. The split recommendation would proceed to the full board for consideration the following month. As we gathered our materials after the contentious session, Lawrence approached me directly for the first time. "You've made quite an impression in your short time with us," he said, his tone suggesting this wasn't entirely complimentary. Thomas always did have a flair for the dramatic. Leaving significant equity to an unknown quantity certainly qualifies. I met his gaze steadily. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Wilson. I understand my arrival was unexpected, and perhaps unwelcome to some. What I don't understand," he continued as if I hadn't spoken, "is your objective. If it's financial security, there are simpler paths than disrupting established foundation protocols." The implication was clear. He was offering a potential buyout, a way to claim my equity without my continued involvement in foundation governance. My objective is to honor Thomas's legacy by contributing meaningfully to the foundation's work, I replied, maintaining professional composure despite my internal indignation. The same objective I imagine you've pursued during your distinguished tenure. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Thomas built something exceptional over decades. Those of us who helped him do so feel a certain protective instinct toward his creation. As do I assured him, though perhaps we define protection differently. Lawrence studied me for a moment longer before nodding curtly. Indeed, Ms. Ramirez. Indeed we do. As he departed, Dr. Wright approached, having observed our exchange from across the room. Lawrence doesn't handle challenge well, she commented quietly, especially from unexpected sources. I'm discovering that, I acknowledged. He'll escalate, she warned. Your investment criteria proposal threatens his vision for the Foundation's future. He won't relinquish that vision without significant resistance. I'm not unfamiliar with resistance, Dr. Wright. She smiled slightly. Elaine, please. And I don't doubt your resilience, Lana. But Lawrence has decades of institutional relationships and considerable influence beyond the Foundation. Proceed with awareness, if not caution. Her warning proved prescient. Within days, I began noticing subtle shifts in the Foundation's atmosphere. Meetings rescheduled. Without explanation, conversations that abruptly ended when I entered rooms. Certain staff members becoming notably less forthcoming with information I requested. Daniel confirmed my suspicions during our next morning meeting. Lawrence is mobilizing his network against your investment criteria proposal. He's characterizing it as a naive overemphasis on social justice metrics at the expense of fiduciary responsibility. That's a deliberate misrepresentation, I objected. The framework explicitly maintains financial performance standards. Of course it does, Daniel agreed. But Lawrence is playing to existing biases about younger, more diverse voices in philanthropic governance, suggesting you represent ideology rather than strategy. The tactic was frustratingly familiar, the same. Dismissal I'd experienced at Sterling & Core, just dressed in more sophisticated language. But unlike those years of silent endurance, I now had both platform and purpose to respond effectively. How do we counter this narrative? I asked. Daniel's expression turned thoughtful. Perhaps it's time for that Denver Tribune interview after all. The Denver Tribune journalist, Marissa Chen, was nothing like I expected. No aggressive interrogation, no sensationalist angle, just thoughtful questions about impact investing and my professional journey. We met in a quiet corner of the Wallace Foundation's library, autumn sunlight filtering through tall windows as we spoke. Let's address what everyone wants to know, she said after preliminary discussions. 8 months ago, you were a mid-level analyst at Sterling & Core. Today, you're a significant stakeholder in one of America's most influential foundations. How does one navigate such a dramatic transition? I considered my response carefully, aware that my words would reach far beyond the Tribune's readership. The transition wasn't as sudden as it appeared externally, I explained. For 8 years at Sterling & Core, I developed expertise in strategic investment analysis, particularly focusing on technologies with both financial and social returns. My godfather, Thomas Wallace, recognized that expertise long before others did. And Edward Sterling tried to claim your inheritance as his own, Marissa stated directly. I maintained composed neutrality. There was a misunderstanding regarding the rightful ownership of certain Wallace Foundation shares. That misunderstanding has been resolved. That's extremely diplomatic considering the circumstances, she observed, studying me with newfound interest. Most people would be more vindictive after such treatment. Vindication doesn't come from public recrimination, I replied. It comes from moving forward productively. The conversation shifted to substantive discussion of my investment criteria proposal, allowing me to demonstrate technical expertise rather than simply defending my position. Marissa proved surprisingly knowledgeable about impact metrics, asking incisive questions that revealed genuine understanding of the field. Your framework suggests that financial and social returns can be complementary rather than competing. Priorities, she noted. That challenges conventional investment wisdom. Conventional wisdom evolves, I responded. 20 years ago, environmental considerations were considered extraneous to investment decisions. Today, climate risk assessment is standard practice at major firms. Social impact measurement is following a similar trajectory, becoming integral to comprehensive investment analysis, rather than remaining an isolated specialty. By the time we concluded, the interview had transformed from potential defensive positioning into a genuine platform for articulating my professional vision. Marissa seemed genuinely engaged by our discussion, taking extensive notes even after turning off her recorder. "One last thing, off the record," she said as we walked toward the elevator. "I interviewed Edward Sterling 3 times over the years. He struck me as someone who confused confidence with competence. You strike me as someone who possesses both, but feels no need to announce either." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched by the observation. "The piece will run next Sunday," she added. "I think you'll be pleased with the framing." She wasn't wrong. The Tribune article, headlined "Beyond Inheritance, Lana Ramirez Brings New Vision to Legacy Foundation," portrayed me neither as victim nor opportunist, but as a qualified professional bringing valuable perspective to institutional philanthropy. My investment criteria framework received detailed explanation, positioned as innovative evolution rather than radical disruption. Most importantly, the piece emphasized my 8 years of professional experience prior to the inheritance, quoting former colleagues, including Jordan, who validated my strategic contributions at Sterling & Core. The article's impact exceeded my expectations. Within days, industry publications picked up the story, generating broader discussion about evolving metrics in impact investing. 3 prominent business schools requested permission to use my framework as a teaching case. The Wallace Foundation received inquiries from other philanthropic institutions interested in implementing similar approaches. Lawrence Wilson was conspicuously silent in the wake of this positive reception. When the investment committee reconvened to finalize recommendations for the full board, he attended but offered minimal commentary, his customary opposition notably muted. "Your public visibility has complicated his narrative," Daniel observed as we reviewed meeting outcomes in his office afterward. "He can't easily dismiss your framework as naive idealism when the financial press is praising its methodological rigor." "It was never about the framework's quality," I noted. "It was about who created it." Daniel nodded slowly. "Lawrence represents a particular generation of philanthropic leadership, one that values traditional credentials and established networks. Your presence challenges assumptions about where expertise resides and whose voice matters in these decisions." "Those assumptions needed challenging," I replied, thinking of countless talented people I'd known whose contributions went unrecognized because they didn't fit predetermined profiles of success. The full board meeting to decide on the investment criteria was scheduled for the following week. As the date approached, I experienced surprising calmness, not because I was certain of victory, but because I'd presented my best work regardless of outcome. The insecurity that had plagued me at Sterling & Core, the constant need for external validation, had gradually diminished during my months at the foundation. The morning of the board meeting, I received an unexpected email from Brittany Shaw. My former colleague had apparently read the Tribune piece and felt compelled to respond. "Lana, I doubt you expected to hear from me, and I wouldn't blame you for deleting this unread. But after seeing your feature in the Tribune, I felt I should acknowledge something. I was wrong about you. For years at Sterling & Core, I participated in a culture that failed to recognize your talents because they didn't manifest in ways we were conditioned to value. I'm still processing my own role in what happened and trying to rebuild my career on more solid ethical ground. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your success has forced me to reconsider many assumptions I once held unquestioningly. Wishing you continued success, Brittany." The message was unexpected and genuinely affecting, not because I needed Brittany's validation, but because it represented something larger, the potential for systems to change when individuals within them were confronted with their flaws. I sent a brief but sincere response thanking her for reaching out, then turned my attention to the day's crucial meeting. The Wallace Foundation boardroom felt different that morning, charged with a subtle energy that suggested everyone recognized the significance of the decision before them. Lawrence Wilson arrived last, impeccably dressed as always but carrying himself with unusual restraint. Daniel called the meeting to order promptly at 9, establishing the single agenda item, adoption of revised investment criteria for foundation assets. The discussion began with presentation of both proposed frameworks, Lawrence's streamlined financial metrics, and my integrated impact assessment approach. What followed was substantive debate, thoughtful, occasionally passionate, but consistently focused on the foundation's core mission rather than personality or politics. Board members raised legitimate questions about implementation challenges, measurement consistency, and potential impact on portfolio performance. I addressed each concern methodically, demonstrating both technical understanding and practical flexibility. Lawrence, to his credit, defended his approach with equal seriousness, emphasizing fiduciary responsibility and established investment principles. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, Daniel called for final comments before the vote. "If I might offer a perspective," Dr. Wright said, her measured voice commanding immediate attention. "We're not simply deciding between competing technical frameworks. We're determining how we understand Thomas Wallace's legacy and the Foundation's purpose going forward." I paused, allowing her words to resonate before continuing. Thomas established this foundation to demonstrate that financial and social returns could be integrated rather than opposing forces. Ms. Ramirez's framework honors that vision while adapting it to contemporary realities. It represents evolution rather than revolution, maintaining what has worked while addressing what needs improvement. Lawrence stirred, clearly preparing to respond, but Senator Ortega spoke first. "I've served on this board since Thomas first assembled it," he noted, his gravitas silencing even Lawrence. "Through market cycles, political shifts, and technological transformations, we've maintained balance between financial prudence and social purpose. Ms. Ramirez's framework preserves that balance while providing more rigorous measurement of outcomes that have always mattered to this foundation." When the vote came, the result was decisive: 9 in favor of my framework, 3 opposed. Lawrence accepted the outcome with surprising grace, offering brief congratulations before departing promptly after adjournment. As board members filtered out, Daniel approached with quiet satisfaction. "Congratulations, Lana. This represents significant institutional evolution. Thank you for creating space for that evolution," I replied, recognizing his careful stewardship of the process. "Thomas would be pleased," he said simply, "not just with the outcome, but with how you achieved it, through substance rather than politics, through persuasion rather than power." That evening, alone in my apartment overlooking the city lights, I reflected on the 8-month journey from Denver to this moment. The transformation had been profound, not just in professional circumstances, but in personal identity. I no longer defined myself in opposition to those who had underestimated me. Instead, I had found purpose in building something meaningful, in contributing to work larger than individual advancement. My phone chimed with a text from Jordan. "Heard about the board vote. Apparently you're officially disrupting philanthropy now. Proud of you." I smiled, typing back, "Not disrupting, evolving." His response came quickly. "Even better." As I set my phone aside, I noticed Thomas's letter on my desk, the one he'd left with my inheritance. I reread his final instruction: "Never let anyone bully you out of your name." At the time, I'd understood it literally, as warning against those who might try to claim my inheritance. Now I recognized its deeper meaning. My name wasn't just legal designation on ownership documents. It was my identity, my voice, my right to define my own worth rather than accepting others' limited vision of my potential. Edward Sterling had tried to erase my name from my inheritance. Lawrence Wilson had tried to minimize my name in foundation governance. Both had failed not because I fought them with their own weapons of intimidation or politics, but because I remained steadfastly myself, focused, prepared, and ultimately unwilling to be diminished. The realization brought unexpected peace. The journey wasn't about vindication against those who had wronged me. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, about writing a story defined by contribution rather than grievance. Thomas had understood this all along. His bequest wasn't primarily about money or equity, but about creating opportunity for me to step into my full capability, to claim the space my talents deserved but that conventional systems had denied me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: implementing the investment framework, evaluating potential ventures, continuing to navigate complex institutional dynamics. But tonight, looking out at the New York skyline, I felt profound gratitude for the path that had led here, even the difficult parts, even the underestimation and dismissal. They had taught me patience, perspective, and the quiet power of working with unwavering purpose while others underestimated your worth. 1 year to the day after Edward Sterling publicly declared I had no vision, no value, and no future, I stood before 200 foundation leaders at the National Impact Investing Summit, presenting the Wallace Foundation's integrated assessment framework as a model for the field. The irony wasn't lost on me. Edward's attempt to diminish me had instead catalyzed a transformation that positioned me as a respected voice in an industry where I'd once been invisible. His words, intended as final judgment on my potential, had instead marked the beginning of an unexpected journey. The framework's success lies in its balance, I explained to the attentive audience. By establishing minimum financial thresholds while creating specific metrics for social outcomes, we maintain fiduciary responsibility while honoring our commitment to measurable impact. From the podium, I could see Daniel nodding approvingly from the front row. Beside him sat Dr. Wright, who had become both mentor and ally during my 14 months at the foundation. Even Lawrence Wilson had attended, though he maintained careful neutrality during the subsequent Q&A session. The presentation generated immediate response. Foundation representatives requesting consultation, impact investors seeking partnership opportunities, academic researchers proposing collaborative studies. By day's end, the Wallace approach had established itself as a benchmark for institutions seeking to modernize their investment strategies. Quite a day, Daniel observed as we shared a quiet dinner afterward. Thomas would have enjoyed watching you command that room. I still feel like I'm building on his legacy rather than creating my own, I admitted. Daniel considered this thoughtfully. Perhaps the distinction matters less than you think. Thomas created institutional infrastructure. You're breathing new life into it. Both contributions are essential. His perspective resonated with my evolving understanding of legacy, not as static inheritance but as dynamic continuum, each generation building upon and reshaping what came before. That understanding deepened the following month when Daniel proposed a significant expansion of my role within the foundation. The Mosaic Learning investment had succeeded beyond projections, establishing strong market position while delivering measurable, educational outcomes for underserved communities. Based on this success, Daniel suggested creating a dedicated educational technology initiative with me as executive director. The position would consolidate our educational investments under cohesive strategic vision, he explained. You've demonstrated both technical understanding and alignment with foundation values. The board supports this direction. All of the board? I asked, thinking of Lawrence. Daniel smiled slightly. Even Lawrence acknowledges results, however reluctantly. The Mosaic metrics are undeniable, both financial and social returns exceeding projections. The opportunity represented everything I'd hoped to achieve professionally. Meaningful work leveraging my strategic expertise toward tangible social impact. Yet, something held me back from immediate acceptance. I need to consider this carefully, I told Daniel. Can I have a week to think? He seemed unsurprised by my hesitation. Of course, take whatever time you need. That weekend, I flew to Denver for the first time since my departure 15 months earlier. The city felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, unchanged in its physical landscape, but fundamentally altered in its relationship to my life. I rented a car at the airport and drove not to my former neighborhood, but to a small cemetery in the foothills. Thomas Wallace's grave was simple despite his wealth, a tasteful stone marker bearing only his name, dates, and the inscription, Teacher, Builder, Friend. I stood before it in the crisp mountain air, gathering thoughts I'd been processing for months. I understand better now, I said quietly. What you were preparing me for all those years. Not just the inheritance, but the responsibility that came with it. The mountain breeze rustled nearby aspen leaves, nature's only response, yet somehow fitting. Thomas had never needed verbal confirmation or external validation. He had simply done the work that mattered, recognized potential where others didn't, and created opportunity for that potential to flourish. I've been offered leadership of a new initiative, I continued. It's everything I should want professionally, but something feels incomplete. The realization had been forming gradually over recent months, a growing awareness that while the Wallace Foundation provided platform and purpose, something essential remained unresolved in my professional journey. Not lingering resentment toward Edward Sterling or Sterling and Core, but rather unfinished business with my own narrative. I think I need to build something of my own, I said finally. Not just contribute to what you built. Is that ungrateful? Only silence answered, but in that silence came clarity. Thomas hadn't left me his legacy to constrain my path, but to enable my choices. The inheritance wasn't destination, but foundation, solid ground from which to launch my own vision. The following morning, I met Jordan for breakfast at our old coffee shop near Sterling and Core. He had indeed landed at a reputable venture firm, looking more relaxed and confident than I'd ever seen him during our shared corporate years. You're considering declining the Wallace position, he observed after I described my dilemma. I can see it in your expression. Am I crazy to even think about it? It's precisely the opportunity I always wanted but never received at Sterling and Core. Jordan considered this thoughtfully. Maybe that's exactly why it doesn't feel completely right. It resolves the old wound, but doesn't necessarily create new possibility. Insight crystallized my emerging understanding. The Wallace role would represent culmination of my previous professional identity, vindication of capabilities that Edward and others had failed to recognize. But perhaps my journey required something more transformative than vindication. When I returned to New York, I requested meeting with Daniel outside our regular schedule. We walked through Central Park, autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet as I explained my decision. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity, I began, but I need to decline the executive director position. Daniel showed no surprise, simply nodding for me to continue. The foundation has given me tremendous growth and purpose, I explained, but I've realized I need to build something that's fully my own, something that draws on all I've learned here, but allows me to establish independent vision. You're thinking of starting your own firm, he stated, rather than asked. An impact advisory focusing on founders from underrepresented backgrounds, I confirmed, using the Wallace framework but applying it specifically to ventures that might be overlooked by traditional capital sources. The way I was overlooked professionally. Daniel was quiet for several steps before responding. Thomas always believed institutional philanthropy needed external innovation to remain vital. New firms challenging established practices, new voices questioning conventional wisdom. He smiled slightly. I suspect he'd approve of your direction. The foundation equity would remain untouched, I assured him. This would be separate professional venture using my own resources. I never questioned that, Daniel replied. Your integrity has been evident from our first meeting. He paused thoughtfully. The foundation could potentially become a client of your advisory firm, assuming appropriate governance protocols. His support moved me deeply, not just for its practical value, but for its affirmation of my evolving path. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. No thanks necessary, he responded simply. Thomas recognized your potential. I've merely created space for it to develop. Over the following months, I developed a comprehensive business plan for what would become Ramirez Impact Advisors. My experience implementing the Wallace framework provided invaluable foundation, while connections, developed through foundation work, offered potential client pipeline. Jordan proved unexpected ally in the launch process, leveraging his venture capital network to identify potential founding clients while providing practical operational guidance. Our friendship deepened through this collaboration, evolving from professional respect to genuine partnership. 6 months after declining the Wallace position, I signed lease on modest office space in downtown Manhattan. The walls remained mostly bare except for 2 significant items, a small Southwestern textile that had once hung in Thomas's office and framed copy of the Denver Tribune article that had helped establish my professional credibility. My first 3 clients included a Black-owned financial technology company focused on community banking access, a Latina-led educational platform serving first-generation college students, and a Native American renewable energy venture developing reservation-based solar infrastructure. Each represented precisely the kind of promising but overlooked opportunity my firm was designed to support. The Wallace Foundation indeed became client as well, retaining my services to evaluate potential investments in the educational technology sector. This relationship provided stable revenue while I built broader client base, allowing me to be selective about additional engagements. 18 months after launching Ramirez Impact Advisors, I received email that momentarily took my breath away. Subject: meeting request from Martin Reynolds, CEO, Sterling and Core Strategies. The message was brief and professional, requesting consultation regarding potential implementation of impact metrics within their investment practice. The firm had undergone complete leadership change since Edward's departure, with new board and executive team explicitly focused on rebuilding ethical reputation. My initial instinct was immediate refusal. Too many difficult memories, too much painful history. But after reflection, I recognized potential value in closure, in demonstrating both to them and to myself how completely I had transcended those limiting circumstances. The meeting was scheduled for their Denver headquarters, my first return to the building since my departure 2 years earlier. As my taxi approached the familiar glass tower, I experienced neither anxiety nor resentment, only mild curiosity about what remained of the organization I had once known. Martin Reynolds proved refreshingly different from his predecessor. Thoughtful, unpretentious, genuinely interested in transforming the firm's approach to investment evaluation. He acknowledged the company's problematic history without defensiveness, explaining comprehensive reforms implemented since the board overhaul. "We've been following your work with considerable interest," he explained after preliminary discussions. "Your impact framework represents exactly the direction we need to pursue, balancing financial discipline with meaningful social metrics." "It certainly generated positive outcomes for our clients," I replied neutrally. "I understand your hesitation," Martin acknowledged. "Sterling and Core treated you abominably under previous leadership. No one would blame you for declining this engagement." I studied him thoughtfully, weighing complex emotions against professional opportunity. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Comprehensive consulting engagement," he replied. "Helping us implement modified version of your framework across our portfolio, training our analysts in proper application, establishing governance protocols to maintain integrity." The irony was impossible to miss, being invited back as expert consultant to the very firm that had once dismissed my strategic capabilities. But the greater irony was my own reaction. Not vindictive satisfaction, but professional interest in meaningful transformation. The company that had once diminished me now needed my expertise to evolve. "I'll consider it," I told him. "But I'd need complete transparency and unambiguous board commitment to implementing recommendations." "Absolutely," Martin agreed immediately. "The board chairman would like to meet with you personally if you're amenable. He specifically requested your involvement." As our meeting concluded, Martin offered building tour, highlighting significant changes since my departure. The once sterile environment had been redesigned with warmer aesthetic and more collaborative spaces. New art from local artists adorned walls previously decorated with generic corporate imagery. Even the staff seemed different, more diverse, more engaged, less performatively busy. When we reached the executive floor, where I had once discovered Edward's fraudulent documents, I experienced momentary disorientation. The space had been completely reconfigured, erasing physical reminders of that pivotal confrontation. "Your former office would have been about there," Martin noted, pointing toward glass-walled conference room now occupying that space. "Not my office," I corrected gently. "I never had office here, just a desk that moved according to others' priorities." He looked embarrassed. "Of course, I apologize for the misunderstanding." "No need," I assured him. "It's actually perfect metaphor for why I built my own firm instead of remaining within institutional structures." As we concluded the tour, Martin made final observation. "The plaque in our lobby, listing firm leaders since founding, no longer includes Edward Sterling's name. The board voted unanimously to, remove it last year after full investigation findings." I nodded acknowledgement but offered no comment. Edward's erasure from corporate history represented justice of sorts, but no longer held significance in my own narrative. My story had evolved beyond reaction to his limitations into creation of my own possibilities. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my hotel room, watching sunset paint. Denver's skyline in brilliant orange and purple. The city that had once represented professional constraint now felt simply like place, beautiful in its mountain backdrop, meaningful in my history, but no longer defining my identity or limiting my potential. My phone chimed with text from Jordan. "How did it go today?" I replied honestly. "Surprisingly healing. They need us more than we ever needed. Them." His response came quickly. "Full circle moment. Proud of you, partner." The word partner wasn't merely figurative. 3 months earlier, Jordan had joined Ramirez Impact Advisors as equity partner, bringing complementary expertise and shared vision for building firm that valued substance over status, impact over image, integrity over expedience. As night fell over Denver, I thought about all that had transpired since that fateful day in the Sterling and Core boardroom, when Edward's attempt to claim my inheritance had instead catalyzed my professional liberation. His declaration that I had no vision, no value, and no future had proven not just wrong, but inversely prophetic. My vision now guided growing advisory firm, helping overlooked founders access capital and support. My value was recognized by clients ranging from grassroots ventures to established foundations. My future extended beyond anything I could have imagined while sitting at that demoted desk near the supply closet. The journey hadn't been about revenge or vindication, but about reclamation of my professional identity, my authentic voice, my rightful place in rooms where decisions were made. The greatest. Victory wasn't watching Edward's downfall, but creating success entirely independent of his limitations. Thomas had understood this all along. Only use it when you're ready, he had written, and never let anyone bully you out of your name. I had done both, waiting for precisely the right moment to assert my ownership, then building something that ensured my name would represent not inheritance or accident of connection, but genuine contribution and earned respect. Standing there as Denver's lights began to sparkle against the darkening sky, I felt profound gratitude for the complete circle of this journey. From invisibility to recognition, from constraint to creation, from being defined by others' limitations to defining my own possibilities. They said I didn't belong in the room, so I built a new room and put my name on the door. And that has made all the difference.